The rain pounded on the roof as if someone was desperately trying to get inside. Sarah sat on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, trying to focus on reading a book, but her attention kept being drawn by strange noises. The old house was full of unfamiliar sounds, creaking floorboards, the light tapping of branches against the windows, but this sound was different. It was footsteps. She froze, listening intently. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps were coming from right above her head, in the attic. Too loud for a rat, too heavy for old wood. Sarah gripped the book tighter, her heart pounding. She knew no one was supposed to be in the attic. She and her brother hadn't even managed to unpack all the boxes yet, and their mother had forbidden them from going up there without her. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps continued, and Sarah felt a cold fear pierce through her. She slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. It's all in my imagination, she told herself. Maybe it's the roof, or a draft, but something deep down told her it was not. She resolutely headed for the door, into the hallway. The stairs below were dark, and only the faint glow of the street lamp filtered through the windows. Sarah slowly looked up at the ceiling. The footsteps had stopped. The house was engulfed in dead silence. It's definitely a draft, she said aloud, hoping it would chase away the fear. But as soon as she stepped into the hallway, the silence was shattered again, this time by a crash. As if something had been dropped in the attic. Sarah froze. It was no longer just a creak. Someone was clearly up there. "Mom?" she called quietly, but there was no answer. Summoning her courage, she approached the attic stairs and, trembling, pulled the cord. The old ladder descended with a loud creak, opening the way into the darkness. Sarah stood at the bottom, looking at the gaping black hole above. Her heart raced in her chest. She grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and stepped onto the first rung. The footsteps started again, this time faster, as if someone or something was moving around in the attic. The flashlight trembled in her hands as she climbed higher. Fear paralyzed her, but something inside pushed her forward. Reaching the top, she slowly directed the beam of light around. The attic was filled with old boxes, cobwebs, and dust, as expected. But there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped, but something had clearly been here just moments ago. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to manage her panic. Then, in the corner of the attic, something glinted. She directed the light and saw an old, dusty lock on the floor. Rusty but still intact, it looked out of place among the clutter. At that moment, the house seemed to draw in a cold breath, and a draft, like the touch of an icy hand, wrapped around her neck. Sarah turned sharply, but all she saw was darkness. The move began early on a Saturday morning. The truck with their belongings was already parked in the driveway of the old house when Sarah, Daniel, and their mother Julia arrived in their new minivan. All three were exhausted from the endless boxes and hustle, but excitement was in the air. The house was their new chapter, a fresh start that everyone had been waiting for. "Here it is, our new home," Julia said with a smile as she parked the car. A truly historic place. The house in Charleston was a real find. A massive two-story mansion with columns on the facade and large windows overlooking the garden. It had not only the architectural beauty of the past century but also something more, an elusive connection to history. As Sarah walked through the yard, she felt her imagination painting pictures of the people who once lived there. "You know, this house is like something out of a movie," Daniel muttered as he got out of the car and looked around. "It seems cool at first, but then you realize it has, well, surprises." "You've just watched too many horror movies," Sarah replied with a smirk, but deep down she understood what he meant. Their mother approached them, holding the house keys. "Do you know how old these walls are?" Julia said with a smile, heading toward the front door. "Almost 200 years. Important people lived here, and now we do too." She inserted the key into the lock, and the door creaked open, admitting them into their new life. Inside, the house looked impressive but slightly abandoned. High ceilings, wide wooden stairs, antique fireplaces, and fabric-covered walls. The smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. "A bit dusty, but nothing we can't handle," Julia sighed, looking around. "We'll make this house cozy." Sarah followed her, carrying her bag. She carefully examined the rooms. Every detail, from the wooden panels to the massive windows, seemed to be from another era. In the kitchen stood a massive oak table, and the living room had antique chairs covered in faded fabric. The house was full of history, but it didn't scare Sarah. On the contrary, it intrigued her. Daniel went upstairs to check out his room. "Hey, Sarah, I have a view of the garden up here," he called from above. "And it looks like I can even see that old well. I heard no one's used it since the last century." "Don't say that," Sarah replied as she climbed the stairs to her own room. Sarah's room was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. The windows overlooked the road and the backyard. The room was spacious, with a high ceiling, wooden floors, and an antique mirror hanging on the wall. In one corner stood a small wardrobe, and by the window was a writing desk. Everything looked like it was from an old film. "How do you like it?" Julia asked, entering the room behind Sarah. "This will be your space for studying and sleeping. I think we'll do a little work on the decor." Sarah nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and slight unease. The room was beautiful in its own way, but there was something about it that made her feel out of place. As if someone had lived there before her and left an invisible mark. "I think I'll need some time to get used to it," Sarah admitted with a slight smile. "Of course," Julia said, gently hugging her daughter. "It's a new home. Everything will be fine. We'll all adjust a little." While they were talking, the movers were carrying boxes and furniture. The house gradually filled with their belongings, transforming from an empty old building into a new family home. But Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that the house still belonged to someone else. At times, she felt as if the walls were watching her with an indescribable sadness. When all the things were finally brought inside, Julia prepared to make lunch. While Sarah and Daniel decided to rest for a bit, Sarah lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, trying to relax after a long day. Suddenly, a faint creak interrupted the silence downstairs. Sarah thought it might be her mother moving furniture or something, but then she heard Daniel shout from his room. "Hey, is someone walking in the attic?" Sarah sat up abruptly, her heart racing again. It had been only a week since they moved into the old house. The family was gradually adjusting to the new conditions. The boxes were almost unpacked, and life was starting to fall into a routine. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, when Julia stayed late at work, Sarah was home alone. Daniel had gone out for a walk with friends, and the house was enveloped in silence. Sarah sat in her room, reading a book, when she suddenly heard a creak. She lifted her head, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway, like someone had quietly opened a door. She felt uneasy. "Daniel?" Sarah called out, but there was no answer. She put the book down and walked to the door. The hallway was empty. The wide wooden floorboards, illuminated by the desk lamp, looked ominous. Sarah glanced around but noticed nothing unusual. Then something cold brushed her skin, as if an unseen presence had passed by, leaving a chilling air in its wake. She shivered involuntarily. Deciding it was just her imagination, Sarah returned to her room and shut the door behind her. But as soon as she sat back on the bed, the door flew open with a loud bang. Sarah jumped up, her heart racing. "What the?" She ran to the door and closed it again. There was no draft. The windows in the hallway were closed, and there was no wind in the room. Sarah slowly backed away, keeping her eyes on the door, expecting it to open again. But this time, everything was quiet. Trying to calm her breathing, Sarah searched for a logical explanation. Maybe the door was just poorly secured? Or the house was so old that the walls were settling? She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and sat back down on the bed. But as soon as she touched the book again, the room began to fill with cold. The temperature dropped sharply, as if all the windows had been thrown open, though they were all closed. Goosebumps rose on her skin. Sarah felt an invisible presence filling the room. At that moment, her heart stopped. She sensed that she was no longer alone in the room. She looked up and saw her breath turning into a white cloud in the cold air. Sarah jumped off the bed and slowly backed toward the door. The deafening noise of her own breathing filled her ears, and her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might leap out of her chest. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, right by the window, stood a shadowy figure. It was vaguely discernible, like a reflection in murky water. Sarah froze, unable to tear her gaze away. The shadow didn't move, but Sarah felt its presence, cold, oppressive, frightening to the core of her being. She couldn't hold back her scream. "Go away," she yelled, her voice breaking with fear. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Sarah stood by the door, trembling and unable to believe what had just happened. The air in the room warmed up again, and the strange cold dissipated as if it had never been there. But the silence that followed was even more frightening. A few minutes later, when she had finally managed to compose herself, she heard the sound of the front door. Daniel was back. Sarah ran into the hallway, her face still pale. "What happened?" Daniel asked, noticing her state. "You won't believe it." Sarah tried to explain, but the words tangled in her mind. "I saw something, it was here, in the room." Daniel frowned. "What did you see?" "I don't know. It was like a shadow. It was just standing there, looking at me. And the door closed by itself, and the cold." "Are you sure it wasn't a shadow from the trees?" Daniel asked, trying to find a rational explanation. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "It was something else. I saw it clearly." Daniel paused, looking at his sister. "Maybe it was just your imagination. The house is old, and we're all a bit on edge because of the move. Let me stay with you tonight, so you don't have to worry, okay?" Sarah nodded uncertainly, but the fear still pulsed inside her. She knew it wasn't just her imagination. A few days had passed since Sarah had first seen the shadow in her room. She tried to convince herself it was just stress from the move, fatigue, or an overactive imagination. But every evening, it became harder to ignore the odd occurrences in the house. Every night, there were footsteps. Sarah was sure they came from the attic, though her mother and Daniel kept insisting it was just the old floorboards creaking or the roof making noise in the wind. But she knew it was footsteps. Clear, measured, as if someone was slowly pacing back and forth in the attic. One night, when the clock on the wall struck midnight, Sarah woke to a muffled sound coming from above. Soft but distinct, like someone was moving right above her head. She froze, trying to convince herself it was just the old house settling, but the sound grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah tensed, listening. These were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, right above her bed. It sounded like someone was cautiously moving around in the attic, checking something, as if searching for an exit or something lost. She swallowed hard, feeling her heart race. She glanced towards the door. The room was shrouded in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. She lay still, listening to the ominous sounds until she gathered the courage to get out of bed. Sarah slowly put on her robe, approached the door, and cautiously opened it. The hallway was empty, with only the faint glow of a nightlight on the wall. The footsteps continued. "Maybe it's just the wind again," she said quietly to herself, feeling a shiver of fear spread through her. But even her voice sounded unconvincing. Sarah decided she needed to check what was happening in the attic. She left her room, carefully making her way down the long hallway to the stairs leading up to the attic. Every step was difficult, as if her legs were reluctant, and her body resisted the decision to go upstairs. When she reached the stairs, the footsteps suddenly stopped. An oppressive silence filled the house, so thick it seemed almost palpable. Sarah looked at the rope leading to the attic hatch and, swallowing hard, decided to pull it. The stairs descended with a loud creak, granting her access to the dark space above. With trembling hands, Sarah turned on her flashlight and directed its beam into the darkness. She stood at the bottom of the stairs for a few seconds, listening to the silence, but nothing happened. Only her heart pounded loudly in her chest. Gathering her courage, she slowly began to climb the stairs, trying not to look into the darkness until her head was level with the attic opening. It was silent, too silent. The flashlight's beam revealed old, dusty boxes and piles of discarded items left by previous owners. Suddenly, Sarah felt a slight draft, as if an invisible presence had passed by. Her heart raced even faster. "Who's there?" she whispered. There was no answer, but at that moment, her gaze fell upon something strange in the corner of the attic. Lying on the floor, she saw an old, heavy padlock, rusty and covered in dust, that seemed to have been recently moved. Sarah approached it slowly, feeling the fear intensify in her chest. The padlock was closed but looked as though it concealed something important. Suddenly, there was a slight creak behind her. Sarah turned, directing the flashlight into the darkness, but no one was there. The emptiness of the attic stared back at her with its cold darkness. She slowly backed away, heading towards the stairs, not taking her eyes off the darkness. When she finally descended back to the first floor and closed the hatch behind her, the footsteps started again, but this time they were quieter, as if someone was slowly retreating deeper into the attic. Sarah exhaled shakily, feeling her legs give way. She could no longer ignore it. Something was in this house. Something that resided in the attic. That night, Sarah couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The footsteps she had heard in the attic kept replaying in her mind. Her heart wouldn't calm down, even hours after she had descended from the attic and closed the hatch. Something was clearly happening in this house, and ignoring it was no longer possible. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning. The house was silent, but this silence brought no comfort. It felt thick and oppressive, as if an unseen threat hung in the air. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination. Old houses always have strange noises, she told herself. It's just the wind or old floorboards. Nothing supernatural. But her body disagreed with her mind. Every muscle was tense as if anticipating something imminent. And it happened. Sarah heard the soft footsteps again. This time they were not coming from the attic but from the hallway right outside her door. Tap, 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 slow, almost gliding steps. It sounded like someone was cautiously moving through the house, checking each room one by one. Sarah's heart raced, her body involuntarily tensed. She froze, trying to make no sound, listening to the sounds outside her door. The footsteps stopped right outside her room. Now she could distinctly hear breathing, heavy, deep, as if someone was standing at the door, listening to what was happening inside. At that moment, the door handle began to slowly turn. Frozen in terror, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the door. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, scream, run, but her body wouldn't obey, as if fear had paralyzed her. The door slowly creaked open, and through the narrow gap, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadowy silhouette. A tall, thin figure standing in the doorway of her room. Its outlines were blurred, as if it were made of dense smoke or fog, but Sarah could clearly see it was a person. Or what once was a person. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might burst from her chest. The figure slowly stepped into the room, its movement unnaturally smooth, as if it were gliding across the floor rather than walking. The moonlight filtering through the curtains faintly illuminated the figure. But she could see neither the face nor any details, only a shadow, faceless and terrifying. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The figure stopped in the center of the room, as if listening to her words. Sarah barely stifled a scream. She felt the cold air enveloping her, making her teeth chatter. Time seemed to freeze, and for a moment, Sarah lost her sense of reality. It was not a hallucination. Not a dream. A real shadow stood before her, a living embodiment of something dark and ancient. The figure took another step forward. Sarah instinctively recoiled, pressing herself against the wall. She felt tears welling up in her eyes from terror, but the scream was lodged in her throat. And then she did what panic dictated, she rushed to the door. Her legs felt like lead, but she yanked the door open with all her strength, bolted into the hallway, and dashed down the stairs. There was no sound behind her, but she felt as if the figure was following her, watching from the darkness. Sarah ran to the first floor, clutching the phone, her trembling fingers dialing the number. But as soon as her fingers touched the screen, the connection was lost. The phone screen went dark, leaving her in complete darkness. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her heart gripped by fear. There was something in this house. Something that wouldn't let her rest. Morning came with the long-awaited light, but it brought neither relief nor peace to Sarah. She hadn't slept a wink all night. Her thoughts kept returning to what had happened, the shadowy figure standing by her bed. She knew it wasn't a figment of her imagination, but she couldn't explain what she had seen. The heavy footsteps, the icy cold that penetrated her bones, it was all too real. At breakfast, she sat silently, staring at her coffee cup. Julia was talking about work, but her voice sounded as though it were coming through a fog. Sarah barely heard her. At that moment, Daniel walked into the kitchen. He looked as if he hadn't slept well either. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, noticing her condition. Sarah looked at him, sighing heavily. "No," she replied honestly. "Something strange is happening in this house, Daniel. Don't you hear the footsteps? Feel the cold? Have you seen them?" Daniel froze, his eyes meeting hers. He slowly set his mug down and sat across from her. "What do you mean?" His voice was tense. "The footsteps at night," Sarah continued, lowering her voice so Julia wouldn't hear. "In the attic. Every night. And the shadow, she faltered, recalling the previous night. Last night, I saw something in my room. It was more than just a shadow, Dan. I know you think I'm losing my mind, but I can't ignore it any longer. Daniel frowned, his face serious. He leaned forward slightly, as if not wanting their mother to overhear what he was about to say. You're not losing your mind, he said quietly. I've seen it too. Sarah froze, unable to believe her ears. What? The shadow, the footsteps, the cold. I've seen and heard it all too. I just didn't want to say anything because I thought it was just hallucinations. That I was just imagining things. Sarah was stunned. All this time she had thought she was alone in battling this inexplicable darkness. But now it turned out Daniel had also become its victim. Why didn't you say anything? She whispered, feeling anger rising within her. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Daniel lowered his head, his fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of his shirt. I thought it was just stress. We'd just moved in. I didn't want you or Mom to think I was losing my mind. But these sounds, they happen every night. And last night, I also saw the figure. It was standing in the corner of my room. Damn, his voice trembled and he ran a hand through his hair. It was so real. I couldn't move, I just watched it until it disappeared. Sarah looked at her brother in silence, realizing that things were far worse than she had thought. They were both dealing with something that defied explanation. And now this something was tormenting them both. What is it? Sarah finally asked, feeling the fear return. Daniel shook his head. I don't know, but we had to do something about it. I can't stand it anymore, Sarah. These nights, this house. It's strange. They sat in silence, feeling the weight of the situation hanging over them. Julia, oblivious to what was happening, continued with her routine. But Sarah and Daniel knew they needed to do something to find out what shadows were hiding within the walls of their home. We need to tell Mom, Sarah said. No, Daniel quickly objected. She won't believe us. You know her. She'll just say it's our imaginations or that we both overheated in the sun. And what then? Are we supposed to stay silent? Sarah felt her voice start to tremble. You understand it won't just go away on its own. We can't just sit and wait for these entities to do something else. Daniel paused for a moment before responding. Okay, we'll come up with something. Maybe we need to learn the history of this house. What happened here before we moved in? These sounds and shadows, they must have come from somewhere. Sarah nodded. It was a sensible plan. They needed to find answers, and for that, they needed to dig deeper. Too much about this house remained unexplained. That day, Sarah and Daniel decided they needed to take action. They agreed to discuss everything with their mother but were unsure how to approach the conversation. Julia was a practical person, and any mention of the supernatural would likely provoke only ridicule or irritation. She had repeatedly said that the kids were just nervous from the move and were seeing things that weren't there. But when Julia herself noticed something strange, the situation changed. In the evening, as Sarah and Daniel sat in the living room, trying to figure out how to start the conversation, Julia emerged from her room. She looked visibly disturbed, which immediately caught their attention. Mom, what's wrong? Sarah asked first, seizing the opportunity. Julia paused for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, then approached the table and sat down across from her children. Did you hear anything last night? She suddenly asked, her voice strained. Sarah and Daniel exchanged surprised glances. This was the first time Julia had taken the initiative. What do you mean? Daniel asked cautiously, though he knew exactly what she was getting at. Last night Julia hesitated and lowered her eyes as if she couldn't believe what she was about to say. I heard footsteps. In the attic. Very clearly. I thought one of you was up there, but when I checked, it was quiet, and you were all asleep. Sarah felt chills run down her spine. Finally, their mother had noticed what she and Daniel had been discussing every night. Now, she couldn't ignore what was happening. Mom, we wanted to talk to you about this, Sarah began cautiously. We hear it too. And not just footsteps. We see figures, shadows, and it happens every night. Julia looked at her daughter, and her expression slowly changed. Distrust gave way to concern. She tried to stay calm, but fear was evident in her eyes. What shadows? Julia asked, struggling to suppress the tremor in her voice. Daniel sighed, realizing that it was time for an honest conversation. We've seen something strange in our rooms, he added. Black silhouettes. Like someone is walking through the house, but they're not people. I don't know how to explain it. It looks unreal, but it's here. And I feel the cold, like someone is breathing nearby. Quote dot. Julia clenched her hands tightly in her lap. She looked lost. Her confidence, which she always tried to maintain for her children's sake, had wavered. I thought it was just the creaks of the old house, she said, as if justifying herself. Everything here is so old. Maybe it's the wind or some natural causes. Sarah shook her head. No, Mom, it's not the wind. I saw a shadow right by my bed. Her voice trembled, but she tried to speak clearly. I felt it. It can't just be imagination. Quote dot. Julia nervously brushed her hair back and rubbed her temples in exhaustion. Are you saying our house is haunted? She weakly smiled, trying to downplay the statement, but even she felt uneasy at the words. Sarah and Daniel remained silent. They didn't know how to respond. But now, with Julia having encountered the inexplicable herself, denying what was happening had become impossible. Julia sat in silence for a long time, contemplating. She was a rational woman, and she had always dismissed any hint of mysticism as nonsense. But this time, her inner calm was shaken. The footsteps she had heard were real. She had gone out into the corridor at night but had found no one. I don't know what to do about this, she finally admitted. Maybe we need to invite someone who understands these things. Or contact the previous owners to find out what happened here before us. Sarah sighed with relief, realizing that their mother was finally ready to take the situation seriously. We could start by finding out the history of the house. Daniel suggested. Maybe something happened here that we weren't told about. Julia nodded, though her face remained tense. Okay, I'll try to find some information tomorrow. Maybe it will give us some answers. She got up from the table, still lost in thought. It seemed she was trying to process what she had heard, to find rational explanations. But something told her that the issue went far beyond just an old house. Sarah and Daniel watched their mother leave for her room, and as they were left alone, they felt the icy fear that had haunted them slightly ease. Now they were all on the same side. But the deeper they dug into the house's mystery, the more questions arose. And the answers they were about to find could be far scarier than they had anticipated. The next morning, as promised, Julia began searching for information about the house. She contacted the real estate agent and tried to find archival records, but everywhere she turned, she was met with disappointment. No one seemed to know anything about the house's past. Its previous owners had long since moved away, and the history seemed to have dissolved into time. However, later in the day, Sarah, unexpectedly, made an important discovery. The day was overcast, and light barely penetrated through the heavy gray clouds. An ominous silence pervaded the house, as if the walls were steeped in a secret they did not want to reveal. Sarah wandered through the house, trying to distract herself from the night's terrors. She was reflecting on their recent conversation with their mother and brother when she noticed the attic hatch. The strange feeling returned, as if something up there was waiting to be found. She sighed and pulled on the rope, opening the hatch. At first, she was reluctant to face the attic again, but something drew her up. It was as if an invisible voice was suggesting that the answers to their questions were hidden up there. Carefully climbing the old steps, Sarah found herself in a cramped, dusty space. Dim light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating old boxes and cobweb-covered items. The air was musty, and each step echoed with a loud creak. Sarah began to explore the attic, unsure of what she was looking for. Her gaze fell on an old wooden chest in the corner. It was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in many years. She leaned over and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, she found old items, yellowed books, a few photographs, and a stack of letters. Sarah picked up the first letter, noticing that the envelope was worn and yellowed with age. The handwriting was beautiful, written in a neat hand, and the date on the envelope indicated that the letters had been written many years ago, in the early 1900s. Her heart skipped a beat. Could this be the key to the house's mystery? Sarah carefully opened the first letter and began to read. My dear Elizabeth, you won't believe what is happening in our house. Every day, I become more fearful for our family. I can no longer ignore these sounds. They come from the walls, from under the floor. John says it's just an old house. But I know it's not. Someone or something is watching us. I see shadows when I go to bed, and the cold fills our bedroom at night. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. These lines were alarmingly familiar. They described what was happening to them now. She quickly read another letter. Elizabeth, last night, something horrible happened. I saw a shadow in our room. It stood right by my bed, as if waiting for something. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. John doesn't believe me, he thinks it's just nerves, but I know the shadows are real. These are not my fears. I'm scared for our daughter. Last night I heard her crying, but when I went to her room, she was asleep, and it was so cold around her. Sarah sighed heavily, her hands trembling. These letters left no doubt. The previous occupants of the house had experienced the same things as they did. Fears, shadows, cold, footsteps, these were all part of some deeper, darker mystery. She pulled out another letter, dated the last days before the family presumably left the house. Elizabeth, we must leave. This place is unsafe. I can no longer stay silent. John found some old documents about the house, and what he learned shocked him. There was a tragedy that had been hidden for many years. I can't tell you everything in this letter, but we can no longer live here. This place is cursed. Sarah gasped, realizing that the last letter was cut off at the most intriguing part. What documents had John found? What tragedy were they trying to hide? She hurried downstairs, clutching the letters, and met Daniel in the hallway. You need to read this, she said, handing him the letters. These are records from previous occupants. They describe the same things we're experiencing. These shadows, footsteps, cold, it's all been here before. Daniel quickly skimmed the lines, his face growing more serious. So what does this mean? He asked, looking at Sarah. It means we're not the first to encounter something in this house. And if the previous owners were right, something terrible happened here. We need to find those documents John mentioned in the letter. They might have the answers. They stood in the hallway, holding the letters, realizing they were at the center of a far more complex and dark story than they had imagined. The house's mysteries were beginning to unravel, and they could no longer ignore them. As evening fell, Sarah and Daniel, armed with the letters they had found in the attic, decided to begin their own investigation. They returned to the house to examine every detail again, hoping to find information about the mysterious documents mentioned in the letters. Julia was busy searching for information on the phone, so they decided not to disturb her. Sarah and Daniel started their investigation by revisiting the old attic where they had found the letters. They hoped to find more clues that could help uncover the mystery. In the attic, they inspected every box, drawer, and shelf. Dust and cobwebs were a constant presence. But their attention was drawn to old folders and documents lying in one corner. Daniel carefully opened one of the folders, and his face reflected surprise. Look at this, he said, pointing to a document he had just pulled out. These are some old archival records. Sarah came closer and read the title, Historical Documents of the House on Lincoln Street. Her heart began to race. They started reviewing the papers, hoping to find something useful. One of the documents contained a floor plan of the house with annotations. The blueprint was marked with various rooms and notes highlighting important details. One such note indicated a room labeled Secret Storage. This room was located in the basement, which they hadn't known about before. This must be somewhere here, Daniel said, holding the plan. We've never checked the basement. Maybe the documents are hidden there. They decided to descend into the basement, which, to be honest, they didn't even know existed. The basement was damp and dark, with walls covered in mold. Daniel, looking dejected, turned on a flashlight, and its beams swept across the walls, illuminating moldy wooden beams and old boxes. This could be dangerous, Sarah warned. We need to be careful. They explored the basement, meticulously examining every corner. Suddenly, Daniel noticed a metal door partially concealed by a rough wooden structure. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, with rusty hinges visible. This looks like what we're looking for, he said, moving closer and trying to open the door. Sarah helped him, and they pushed the door with effort. It creaked open a few inches. Inside, they found a small room filled with old items and documents. The floor was cluttered with papers, and among them were folders with records and letters. They began sorting through the documents, and Sarah soon came across a book with a cover marked in gold letters, History of the House and Its Inhabitants. She opened the book and started reading, her eyes filling with horror. Look at this, she said to Daniel, pointing to the pages. It describes events that happened in the house. Everything we're experiencing seems like a repetition of old tragedies. Daniel took the book and examined it closely. It describes several tragic events that had occurred in the house in the early 20th century, related to a mysterious illness that claimed the lives of many members of the family living there. This matched what had been mentioned in the letters they had found earlier. It seems there were several victims, Daniel said, pointing to an article in the book. And all of them died under mysterious circumstances related to this house. Sarah nodded. She again noted a section in the book mentioning that the illness or calamity that struck the house led many residents to leave, leaving the house empty. This is awful, she said. It seems the house was cursed, and now its darkness continues to haunt those who move in. They found several more documents supporting this theory and recorded everything they could. It remained to be seen how this dark history was connected to what was happening now. As they continued to study the found documents, Sarah felt they had found the key to the mystery, but it was only part of the puzzle. Now, they needed to understand how this dark history was linked to their present and what could be done to end the chain of fear and pain that haunted their home. The day after their discovery, Sarah and Daniel felt an increasing tension. It seemed that with each passing hour, the atmosphere in the house grew darker and more oppressive. Their findings in the basement and the letters from the attic took on a new, more sinister meaning. They now understood that their problems were far from mere coincidences. In the evening, as darkness began to fall outside, strange things started happening in the house again. At first, it was the same footsteps in the attic that Sarah and Daniel had grown accustomed to hearing at night, but now the sounds were louder and sharper, as if someone were moving heavy furniture. Julia, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, turned pale upon hearing these sounds. "What now?" she whispered, staring at the ceiling. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. Something in the house was clearly becoming more active. It could no longer be attributed to the old house, the wind, or creaky floors. The sounds continued, each new thud coming closer and louder. Daniel stood up, nervously looking around. "Maybe we should go up and see what's going on," he suggested, but Julia quickly shook her head. "No, we're not going up there anymore," she said, nervously hugging herself. "I can't take this anymore. We need to leave." But even as she spoke those words, new oddities began in the house. The light in the hallway started to flicker. The bulbs blinked as if they were running out of electricity, then went out completely. Sarah flinched and jumped to the switch, trying to turn the light back on, but nothing happened. "What the?" Daniel stopped mid-sentence as a cold wave appeared directly in front of him. It felt as if the air around him had thickened and turned colder, as though an unseen presence was standing close by. "Do you feel that?" Sarah glanced around. The sudden cold enveloping them was unbearable, as if winter had burst into the house, leaving them in chilling darkness. Julia suddenly screamed as a curtain near her chair started to move, as though someone had tugged on it. "This can't be real," she whispered. "This can't be happening." But even her skepticism began to fade. Sarah could see her mother's confidence slipping away. The oddities they had considered nighttime fears were now happening in broad daylight, and everyone in the house felt it. Sarah turned around and felt something moving behind her. She slowly turned and froze. In the darkness, near the window, stood a figure, tall and indistinct, like a shadow, but with a clear human shape. Sarah's heart stopped. "Mom," she said in a strained voice, not taking her eyes off the shadow. Julia looked up and immediately turned pale. Jumping up, "We can't stay in this house any longer." But at that moment, there was a loud creak, and the door leading to the hallway slammed shut with such force that the walls shook. The three of them froze. "It doesn't want us to leave," Daniel murmured, unable to believe his words. Sarah looked at the door and at the shadow, which still stood motionless by the window. Her thoughts were in a whirl, but one thing was clear: something or someone in the house was actively opposing their attempts to understand what was happening. The strangeness intensified with each minute, as if the very evil that had seeped into these walls was coming to life. The light flickered again and turned on for a split second, illuminating the room, but then immediately went out. Cold and fear enveloped them, paralyzing their actions. "We have to get out while we still can," Julia insisted, but it seemed that the house itself was against this. The noises from the attic grew even louder, and now it sounded like someone or something was coming down the stairs towards them. After the frightening incident with the shadows and strange noises in the house, Sarah, Daniel, and Julia decided it was time to finally deal with the attic. Everything pointed to the answers being hidden there, and despite their fear, they understood that running away now would mean leaving many questions unanswered. All morning, Julia had been trying to reach the real estate agent to get information about the previous owners, but with no success. Each time, she was told that the archives contained nothing significant. This silence from the authorities only heightened their anxiety. "It's time to end this," Sarah said firmly, holding a flashlight. "We need to find that hideaway." Daniel nodded silently, and although fear was evident on his face, he was ready to support his sister. They approached the attic hatch again. Julia insisted on staying downstairs, and the kids decided not to argue. Opening the hatch and climbing the stairs, Sarah and Daniel found themselves back in the attic where they had previously found letters and documents. But this time, they were more determined in their search for a hideaway they suspected concealed more than just old papers. As they climbed up, the air was even heavier and thicker than before. Dust hung in the air as if the very atmosphere of the attic was saturated with something old and abandoned. The beams of their flashlights cut through the dense darkness, illuminating piles of old belongings. "Do you think it's somewhere around here?" Daniel asked, trying not to look at the dark corners where new shadows seemed to lurk. "It should be," Sarah replied, scanning the room. "The letters point to some kind of hideaway where key documents or possibly something else might be hidden." They began to carefully examine the floor, walls, and even the old furniture left by previous owners. Sarah felt every panel and board, hoping to find something that could be moved or opened. Suddenly, her gaze fell on one of the wooden beams. It appeared unusually new compared to the other parts of the attic. Sarah crouched down and ran her hand along the board. It was less dusty than the rest. With some effort, she pried up the edge and felt the board start to give way. "Daniel, come here," she whispered, trying to move the board aside. Daniel rushed over and helped his sister, and within seconds, a small hideaway was revealed. Inside, there was an old leather folder neatly tucked away. A faint smell of mold and something long forgotten wafted from it. "This must be it," Daniel said, peering at the folder. "There's something important here." They carefully pulled it out of the hideaway and sat on the floor, ready to open their find. Sarah gently opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents and photographs that looked even older than those they had found earlier. Some pages were covered in tiny handwriting, others were reports dated 1912. "This is the history of the family that lived here," Sarah said, examining the photographs of people dressed in early 20th century attire. One of the photographs showed the house, their house, only in better condition, with well-maintained gardens and a beautiful facade. But what caught Sarah's attention were the faces of the people in the picture. One face seemed particularly familiar, a girl standing next to a man, with the same features as the figure Sarah had seen a few nights ago by her bed. "This is her," Sarah whispered, pointing to the photograph. "This is the shadow I saw." Daniel struggled to process her words, but he felt that it was true. Everything was falling into place. The spirits of the past continued to linger in the house, and this photo was proof of who they had been in life. They began reading the documents and soon came across a letter written by a man named John. The letter spoke of the death of his daughter, who had died under mysterious circumstances in the house. Shortly after her death, other family members began to notice strange occurrences, footsteps, cold shadows appearing at night. "This sounds like what's happening to us," Daniel said, flipping the page. They also faced this, and it seemed to haunt them until their death. Sarah continued reading. One letter mentioned that the family had tried to find a way to calm the house, but no one knew how. The house's secrets had seeped into the walls, and it seemed that even the family's departure couldn't put an end to it. The last page of the folder contained a short note written with a trembling hand. "We can no longer live here. This house takes souls. Forgive us if we left you our fears, but run while you still can." Sarah froze, realizing that the last sentence was a warning to those who would come here later. This letter carried not only sorrow but also a hope for salvation if someone dared to leave before it ensnared them. "We need to leave," Sarah said decisively. "They tried to warn us. We can't stay here any longer." Daniel nodded silently. The attic hideaway, revealing the grim secrets of the past, had shown them the whole truth. But now the main task remained: to find a way to leave the house once and for all before it consumed them too. When Sarah and Daniel returned from the attic, their hearts were pounding, and cold fear gripped every cell of their bodies. The secret they had uncovered was more terrifying than they had imagined. They realized they were not the only ones held captive by this house. The inhabitants of the past had tried to warn them, but the spirits of this place were still here. And now one of them was making its presence known more clearly. A dark, frosty night had settled over the house. Julia was sitting in the living room when Sarah and Daniel entered, holding the folder with the documents they had found. Her eyes were wide, and her face was set in helplessness. She could see their tense faces and knew they had discovered something horrifying. "We need to talk," Sarah said, placing the folder on the table. "We need to leave." But as soon as Sarah spoke those words, a cold gust of wind swept through the house, even though all the windows were closed. They felt it simultaneously, as if something invisible but infinitely real had entered the house. Suddenly, she appeared before them, Helen. In the corner of the room, barely distinguishable in the half-light, a shadowy figure emerged. This time, it did not vanish immediately. The figure that Sarah and Daniel had seen for several nights was now clearer. It was a young girl with long dark hair and sad eyes, dressed in an old-fashioned dress from the early 20th century. "That's her," Sarah whispered, grabbing Daniel's hand. "Helen." The spirit stood motionless, as if observing them but not approaching. Julia gasped at seeing the ghostly figure for the first time, but her fear quickly gave way to a strange calm. Although the presence was eerie, it did not seem hostile. "Helen," Sarah said cautiously, "do you want to tell us something?" The shadow flickered, and for a moment the room was plunged into an even deeper cold. Then Helen took a step forward, but her footsteps made no sound. She approached an old mirror standing in the corner of the living room and froze before it. A slight ripple appeared on the glass, as if someone had brushed their hand across its surface. "She's showing us something," Daniel whispered. Sarah moved closer, observing the spirit by the mirror. A faint tremor in the air around Helen indicated her connection to the object. Sarah remembered something from the letters. They mentioned that Helen had been obsessed with her reflection. In her final days before her death, she had constantly gazed into that very mirror, as if searching for something beyond reality. The mirror, Sarah realized, it's connected to her soul. She cautiously approached the mirror and touched its cold surface. The moment her fingers made contact with the glass, the room shuddered, as if the house was responding to her action. Before Sarah's eyes, scenes from the past began to flicker, images of people who once lived in the house. Among them was Helen, the very girl whose life had ended within these walls. Sarah saw her dying alone, consumed by fear and despair. "She's stuck here," Sarah whispered, feeling the horror of Helen's story resonate in her heart. "She can't leave." Helen moved again, her hands almost touching the mirror's glass. Her eyes, full of sadness and suffering, gazed directly at Sarah as if pleading for help. "Do you want us to do something?" Daniel asked, standing behind his sister. Suddenly, the mirror trembled as if something was awakening within it. Its surface grew dull, and words slowly appeared on the glass. Sarah and Daniel froze as they read. "Free me. She's asking for help," Sarah said, feeling cold sweat on her forehead. "She can't leave on her own." Helen continued to stand by the mirror, as if waiting for them to understand what needed to be done. Julia couldn't tear her eyes away from the spirit, her hands trembling. "But how?" Julia asked weakly. "How can we free her?" Sarah frantically thought, recalling all the clues from the letters. Helen was connected to this house, but especially to the mirror. Perhaps her spirit was trapped within it? "I think the mirror is keeping her here," Sarah said, looking at Daniel. "Maybe if we destroy it, Helen will be able to leave." "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with tension. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "But if she's asking for help, we have to at least try." Daniel looked at the mirror, then at Helen's shadow. He sighed and nodded. They had to act. "All right," he said, "let's do it." They found a heavy hammer in the garage, and with bated breath, Sarah approached the mirror. Helen seemed to watch their every move closely. Sarah paused for a moment, looking at the spirit, then decisively raised the hammer. When the hammer struck the mirror, a sharp clang echoed. The glass shattered, and the light in the room began to flicker. At the moment the mirror finally broke, a loud roar filled the room, and the entire space was engulfed in darkness. The cold vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The air around them grew warm and calm, and Helen's shadowy figure dissolved along with the mirror's shards. Julia went to the children, embracing them as they stood in silence. It was over. Helen was no longer bound to the house. But a mysterious silence still lingered in the air. They had freed Helen, but was this the end of the nightmare? Several days had passed since the destruction of the mirror and the disappearance of Helen's spirit. Sarah, Daniel, and Julia felt an eerie silence that had settled over the house. It seemed that Helen's disappearance should have ended the series of strange events, but something still felt off. Questions remained more numerous than answers. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Although Helen was freed, she sensed that there was an even deeper and more terrifying secret behind the house. Every time she thought about the letters and the visions that had come to her and Daniel, something inside her hinted that they hadn't uncovered everything. One morning, when Julia had gone into town for groceries, Sarah decided to revisit the letters and documents left in the attic. She took them in her hands and slowly flipped through them, reading lines that now seemed more significant. Among the papers was another photograph she had not noticed before. The photo, taken in the early 20th century, depicted their house with a man, a woman, and a child in the foreground. Sarah didn't know who these people were, but the man's face seemed familiar. She stared at it and suddenly remembered seeing him among the visions that had come to her at night. Whoever he was as important to the house's history as Helen. She decided it was time to seek help to understand what had happened in this place many years ago. Her intuition suggested that there might be people in the town who knew more about the house's past. Sarah gathered the documents and convinced Daniel to accompany her to the local historical society. They arrived at the old building in the town center where the archives were kept. Inside, it was quiet, with only a few visitors searching for information in old books and documents. Sarah approached a woman at the desk. Her hair was gray, her face lined with wrinkles, but her eyes shone with wisdom. "Excuse me," Sarah began, "we recently moved into a house on Maple Street. I would like to know more about its history. We've had unusual events, and it seems related to the previous owners." The woman looked at Sarah and Daniel with interest. "The house on Maple Street?" she asked. "I've heard of it. An old house that has changed owners many times. They say strange things happened there. Are you sure you want to know the truth?" "Yes," Sarah replied firmly. "All right," the woman nodded. "My name is Mabel. I'm the archivist, and I can help you. But be aware, some stories are better left in the past." Mabel led them to the back of the building, where old documents related to the city's history and its houses were stored. She began searching through records, flipping through journals, newspapers, and real estate transactions. After a few minutes, she pulled out an old folder and placed it in front of Sarah and Daniel. This house belonged to the Holloway family in the early last century. The husband and wife, John and Martha Holloway, lived there with their daughter Helen. The story is well known in our town. First, Helen died, and then her parents perished under mysterious circumstances. No one ever understood what exactly happened. Some say they were cursed. Others think the house itself absorbed their souls. Sarah exchanged a glance with Daniel. This information matched what they already knew. But something was still unclear. "And the other owners?" Sarah asked. "After the Holloways, did anyone else live there?" Mabel sighed and continued flipping through documents. "Yes. After them, the house stood empty for a long time until the 1950s. When another family, the Fletchers, bought it. But they didn't stay long. They say that after a few months, they suddenly left, leaving the house in disrepair. Since then, no one has stayed there for long." Daniel frowned. "Did anyone survive from those who lived there? Perhaps there's a witness to those events?" Mabel thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "There is one person who might help you. It's the Fletcher's son, Thomas. He was a child when they lived in the house. But after they moved, he spoke several times about what he saw and heard there. He now lives in a nursing home nearby. But be cautious, Thomas isn't always in his right mind. The passage of time and the fears he experienced have taken their toll on him." Sarah felt her heart race. This new witness could be the key to understanding. Perhaps Thomas Fletcher knew more about what happened in their house than anyone else. "Can we meet with him?" she asked. "Of course," Mabel replied, writing down the address. "But don't expect him to tell you everything right away. Thomas is a complex man, and his memories may be distorted by fears and time." Sarah thanked her and took the address. This was their next goal. Thomas might shed light on the events they could only guess at so far. Perhaps he would help them understand what else was hidden in their house, and how to stop it before it was too late. Sarah and Daniel arrived at the nursing home late in the morning. The building was old, with peeling paint on the walls. but well maintained. Flowers grew around the grounds, and there was an air of calm and serenity that their own home lacked. A young nurse greeted them at the reception desk with a friendly smile. "We'd like to see Thomas Fletcher," Sarah said, showing the note Mabel had given them. The nurse nodded, but her expression became slightly somber. "Certainly. But I should warn you, he's not always in the best condition," she added. "He has been through a lot. Sometimes he talks about very strange things." "That's exactly what we need," Daniel said, exchanging a glance with his sister. The nurse led them through narrow corridors to a small, bright room. There, by the window, sat an elderly man with gray hair, a tired gaze, and a thin frame. He looked frail, as if a strong wind could carry him away. "Thomas, you have visitors," the nurse said gently before leaving them alone. Thomas turned his head, his eyes flickering with weak interest. He looked at Sarah and Daniel for a few seconds, as if recognizing something familiar in them. "You're from that house, aren't you?" Thomas suddenly said, his voice weak but carrying the weight of old memories. "You've come for answers." Sarah nodded. "Yes. We live in the house on Maple Street. We know you lived there, and we want to know what happened. We found letters, old documents, and Helen. We saw her." At the mention of Helen's name, Thomas's face darkened. He flinched as if the name had revived a long-forgotten pain. "Helen, poor Helen," he whispered, turning to look out the window. "Her death was just the beginning. That house, it's cursed." Sarah and Daniel exchanged glances, realizing that Thomas indeed knew more than they could have imagined. "You mentioned the house is cursed," Sarah began cautiously. "But what exactly happened? Why is all this happening?" Thomas was silent for a long time, as if struggling with himself, trying to decide whether to talk about the past. Finally, his voice trembled. "My family moved in during the 1950s. We thought we had found our perfect home," he began, "but from the very first days, I felt that something was wrong. I heard whispers and saw shadows. No one believed me at the time. But I knew the house had a life of its own. And I wasn't the only one who realized it. My father soon began noticing strange things too. He was a skeptic and didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But one day he found old things in the attic, things from the Holloway family." Sarah tensed. She had heard of the Holloways, but now she had a feeling that Thomas was about to reveal something important. "We found the Holloways things too," she said. "What did your father do with them?" Thomas closed his eyes, and his face flushed with the bitterness of memories. "My father found John Holloway's diaries. There was a story no one was supposed to know. The Holloways? They weren't an ordinary family. Their family was connected to the house more deeply than anyone could have guessed. John Holloway made a deal with something." Thomas lowered his voice, as if afraid of being overheard. "He wanted immortality, wanted to keep his daughter eternally young. He performed a ritual that trapped her soul in the house. But something went wrong. Helen died, and her spirit remained here, trapped." Daniel, who had been listening silently, couldn't hold back. "Wait, you mean to say her father deliberately bound her soul to the house?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, but he didn't know that when a soul gets trapped, it doesn't stay the same. It becomes part of the house. The house starts to live its own life. Helen became its prisoner. And after her death, the house demanded more victims. First her parents, then my family." "But how did you survive?" Sarah asked, looking into Thomas's eyes. "How did you manage to leave the house?" Thomas looked at her with sadness. "We left too late. My mother died of an unknown illness soon after we moved in. My father went mad. He was obsessed with those records, trying to find a way to destroy the curse. But the house wouldn't let him. One day he vanished. I was a child, but I knew the house took him." "How did you manage to leave?" Daniel asked again. "My father left me a clue," Thomas continued. "Before he disappeared, he told me that the ritual John Holloway performed could be undone. To do that, you need to find the place where it was done. I knew that place was the attic. I tried to save my father, but it was too late. I managed to escape only because I broke all the mirrors in the house." The mirrors were the key. Thomas looked at them seriously. "And if you broke the mirror, then you've attracted the attention of what is hidden in the house." Sarah turned pale, recalling how they had destroyed Helen's mirror. They had thought it would help free her. But according to Thomas, they might have unleashed something more. "And what should we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. Thomas thought for a moment. "You need to find the diaries. They might contain information on how to complete the ritual. But be careful. The house won't let you just take what you need. Sarah and Daniel realized their investigation was far from over. They needed to find John Holloway's diaries and figure out how to finally free Helen and sever the house's hold. After meeting Thomas, Sarah and Daniel were filled with tense anticipation. They now knew that their home was not just an old mansion with a history but a place steeped in dark energy and linked to a mysterious ritual. Time was running out. Every day spent in that house could be their last. They decided they could no longer delay. They needed to find John Holloway's diaries and complete what had begun many years ago. Returning home, the atmosphere seemed even heavier than before. The walls, which had previously been mere silent observers of their fear, now felt like active participants in the events. It was as if the house was watching them, ready to thwart any attempts to uncover its secrets. "We need to go back to the attic," Sarah said quietly as they entered the house. Thomas said the ritual was performed there. "I'm sure the diaries are somewhere up there." Daniel nodded silently. They both felt the growing tension. But there was no turning back. This was their only chance to rid themselves of the curse that had haunted their family. With flashlights in hand and cautious steps, they made their way to the stairs leading to the attic. The closer they got, the colder the air around them became. With each step, it felt as if the house was breathing down their necks, its dark energy thickening around them. Opening the attic door, they once again found themselves among old boxes, dusty covers, and long-forgotten items. But now they knew what to look for: the diaries, possibly hidden in one of the undiscovered compartments. They began to sift through the boxes, brushing off layers of dust and carefully pulling out old books. Finally, Daniel noticed something strange. One of the floorboards was slightly raised. He knelt down and carefully moved it aside. Beneath the board was a small box. The old, weathered lid gave way easily, and inside they found 3 darkened notebooks, John Holloway's diaries. Sarah picked up one of the diaries with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were filled with indecipherable handwriting, but gradually the letters began to form clear words. John Holloway detailed how he discovered an ancient ritual that promised eternal life for his daughter. However, the ritual required a sacrifice. He thought he could bypass this condition but did not realize the power he was awakening. The soul of the loved one will be bound to this place forever until the final step is completed. Sarah read aloud, peering at the page. "Final step?" Daniel asked, looking over her shoulder. Sarah quickly flipped through the pages until she found the relevant entry. The final step of the ritual required those who wished to free the soul to offer something they cherished most as a sacrifice. "This means we have to lose something to free Helen," Sarah whispered. "But what?" Before they could discuss it further, the attic was filled with icy air. Shadows began to stir, and it seemed as if a figure emerged from the very darkness before them. The shadowy figure Sarah had seen by her bed. But this time, it was not just a ghost. It was John Holloway himself. "You should not have come here." His voice was low and heavy as if coming from another world. "This house is my prison, and yours too. Helen will remain here forever, just like me." Sarah and Daniel stepped back, realizing they were facing the man who had started it all. John Holloway had condemned his family to suffer for his selfish desires. "It's your fault," Sarah cried out, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "You created this nightmare, you condemned your daughter to suffer. We know how to stop it. We will free her." John's figure hesitated, and his ghostly eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The house won't let you leave. It has become a part of you. If you try to complete the ritual, it will take what you hold dear." Sarah could no longer hold back her emotions. Her voice was filled with determination. "We will do it. I am ready." She took out the diary and read the final words of the ritual. Now they understood that to break Helen's connection to the house, they had to offer a sacrifice, not material but spiritual. They would need to relinquish their memories, their attachment to the house and the past, to free Helen. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked Daniel quietly. He nodded, realizing that this was the only way. "We'll do it for her." They took each other's hands, and Sarah recited the final words of the ritual. A strong wind rose around them, and shadows began to move faster. Swirling into a vortex, the house shook with this force, trying to hold them back. John Holloway's shadow vanished into the whirlwind, and before them appeared Helen. She looked serene, her face free from pain. Her ghostly eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered and dissolved into the air. The house abruptly stilled. The wind ceased, and everything around them fell into silence. Sarah and Daniel stood in the attic, feeling the tension leave them. The silence was deafening, but there was a lightness to it. Helen was free. They descended from the attic, feeling that it was all over. The house, which had been their enemy, now seemed empty and lifeless. The curse was lifted, but the price had been high. They knew that the house would never be a home to them again. Now there was only one thing left: to leave this place forever. Morning arrived unexpectedly quiet, as if the nightmares of the night had been left far behind. Sarah woke with a faint feeling of emptiness. But when her gaze fell on the bright beam of sunlight coming through the window, she felt a strange relief. For the first time in weeks, the house no longer seemed hostile. It was simply an old, empty building, no longer living its own life. Daniel entered her room, still a bit shaken, but his eyes were clear. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Sarah nodded, feeling the exhaustion slowly leaving her body. "Yes, it seems we did it. She's free." They sat in silence for a few minutes, processing the events of the previous night. The house was no longer a trap for them and Helen, but their connection to it had also been severed. They understood that staying there no longer made sense. "We need to leave," Sarah finally broke the silence. "This house is no longer ours." "I know," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm. "We've done all we can. It's time to move on." They went downstairs, where Julia was sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee and gazing out the window. She looked anxious, but her face relaxed when she saw the children. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said, not waiting for their questions. "This house no longer feels like the right place for us. I've already started looking for a new place." Sarah and Daniel exchanged glances, surprised that their mother had come to the same conclusion without knowing all the details of what had happened. "That's a good idea," Daniel said. "We were thinking the same thing." Julia frowned slightly. "Something happened, didn't it? I felt like something had changed in the house." Sarah took a deep breath, searching for the right words. She wasn't sure how much detail to go into. "We found John Holloway's diaries," she began. "It turned out that Helen was trapped here because of a ritual her father performed. We completed it. She's free now." Julia looked at Sarah with bewilderment, as if trying to process the information. "That sounds like madness," she finally said. "But at the same time, I believe you. I don't know exactly what happened here, but I'm glad it's over." Together, they began packing their things, preparing to leave. The house now seemed empty, not just physically, but emotionally as well. All the oddities that had filled it had vanished with the curse. The walls no longer whispered, the shadows no longer moved, and the air was no longer filled with anxiety. One last time, climbing up to the attic, Sarah and Daniel looked over the space that had become their battlefield. Here, they had faced the past, the ghosts, and the secrets. But now it was just an old, dusty room. "I wonder what will happen to this house," Daniel mused, looking at the closed boxes and broken mirrors. "I think it will wait for the next family," Sarah said with a faint smile. "But this time, I hope it will be different." As they walked outside, carrying the last boxes, the morning sun warmed their faces. The house stood majestically and quietly, as if it had finally found peace. "What's next?" Julia asked as they got into the car. "A new life," Sarah replied, looking at the house as it slowly receded in the distance. "Things will be different now." Their car drove down the gravel road, leaving the old house behind. A house that had witnessed many lives and tragedies had finally found peace. The Holloway family was freed, and along with them, Sarah, Daniel, and Julia were ready to leave the past behind. The future awaited them, and they were ready to meet it.